Welcome to Leaping the Abyss, a set of 7 podcasts hosted by Gail and Matt Taylor designed to help listeners think about their own agency and world perspective, and how individual ideas, values, actions, and beliefs help to shape and give life to the emerging paradigm, by design or default. Each of the 7 podcasts has a different interviewer, each familiar with the particular subject being explored. These roughly 30-minute interviews are more questions than answers, more nudging than perspective. For the first of the series, we welcome Michael Hopp discussing The Hidden Factor.
Great. So Matt and Gail, great to be talking with you today. Now, in a time of incredible change, the one thing I've noticed is that change agents have been asking for change for many, many years. And yet those very same people who've been asking for change now look like deer in the spotlight. They're just not able to comprehend how many changes we've experienced in such a short space of time. And so I guess my initial question to you is, it looks to me as if change agents aren't ready to deal with the rate of change. So how does one keep up with what's happening so very quickly around us? Is it even possible to keep up with the rate of change that we're seeing today?
Well, yeah, I think the word I like to use is to be requisite. And that's different from keeping up, knowing, controlling, and stuff like that. You have to be flowing with the flow. If you fall into a river that's going down towards you have to get with the flow. You have to be requisite with it. You don't have to conquer it. You don't have to understand all of it. So I think that's one part. And I think that the change agents were change agents in their head, not in their practice. And so we need to be in theory and practice integrated. And those are the moving of the way we think about it and the way we act to that larger holistic view, rather than I'm a professor of so-and-so and I can predict this, but I never walked outside the door, kind of thing.
That's a great point that you made about being a change agent in head and not in action. Can you maybe give us some examples? Maybe take, for example, a business leader who a day before shelter in place was announced, maybe knew that he would have to implement some changes. But so in his actions, what would have made a good leader, somebody that's capable of changing fluidly? Do you have some examples?
I think about myself. And when we modeled this in the 70s, the rate of change as being greater than anything since the Middle Ages. And it was in my head. I had a good model of it. Now in reality, it's like, oh my gosh, it's so much more real, so encompassing, so embedding, in terms of everything that I didn't realize before. But also we're developing a new language. We didn't have exponential rates of change when most of change agents were thinking about the future. We didn't have quantum time understood very well. We didn't, we're the last couple of years have given us and are giving us today a new vocabulary, a new way of understanding a lot of things, which change agents didn't have access to, or didn't know they had access to, or didn't know how to state that. And so the question is, how fast can we learn and use these new tools that are showing up every day?
It's also, where do you put your resource? I knew an Air Force officer who was in charge of transferring the X-16 to Japan, and they wanted to build it themselves, which was logical. So he had to do the whole transfer process. But when he went and sat down with them for the first time, the first place they took them, they showed him their several 100-year plan for Japan. And it was not an airy-fairy thing. It was a plan. Now, of course, that's going to change. But the point is, that culture looks at time differently than the American culture, far more comprehensively. And a lot of people say, well, I don't have time to do that. Well, do you have time to run into a brick wall in 10 years with your corporation? So corporations and people have to be constantly thinking about these things and reading history. this isn't the first time we've been through this kind of thing on a global basis. It's just that we didn't have the technology to record it all, but it's in the records.
It's in our DNA.
Yeah.
Right. You raised a good point there about Japanese tending to plan much longer in advance. Is that still relevant today? And do you think American companies, for example, should have a 30, 40, 50-year plan in addition to being very tactical and very able to move very quickly?
Yeah, I'll tell you why. Because if we say, look, we're going to build a new kind of plant, a new energy kind of plant that's going to have these kinds of things, and we're going to have it in 10 years. Well, the first thing when I hear that, I'm going to look at it and say, well, that means that even with our current knowledge, which is limited, we need these resources, we need these people, we need a place. It takes X number of years to build a major kind of plant of anything, and so on and so on. So I can look and start to see, is that happening? We call this weak signal research. Where are the weak signals out there? And where are the weak signals that would stop that? Like, is this going to cause ecological problems in some people's mind? And will they put up a block to this and try to stop you? And so you can have these plans, and we chart them out in flow charts. We can have them because once you have that, even if the first cycle is 5% accurate, that gives you an abundance of questions to ask and things to look for and challenges to make.
I was just thinking about without this longer perspective, it's very difficult to see a system or systems interacting with each other. And businesses are very used to mechanical systems and thinking that that's how life happens. We're not thinking about nature and learning as nature and learning as we go, as a response. We think we're supposed to have answers, whether we have context or not. If you leap out there to say, what are all the things that I can change systematically and with ease when we're doing it all together as a flow rather than changing one thing in an organization, i.e. the educational process or the economic or whatever. When we divide that all up in businesses, there's no way that makes any sense to think about the future.
You know, in another point, when Steve Jobs introduced the iPad the first time, the first little iPad, he said that he sent one to one of his ex-colleagues that he had known years ago, because he says to him, is this good enough to criticize? Because that person had said, the stuff that we have isn't good enough to criticize. Now, don't bore me with it. If you go back 1946, as we may think, if you look at all the pioneers of these instruments we use today, it was all written down by 1960. It was tested. The technology wasn't there, the economics weren't there, but what we are doing today that we look at are ideas that are 30, 40, 50 years old. The first time that NASA went around the moon, not landed or just went and swung around and came back, they went by an orbit. It was the only way they had enough power. They went by an orbit that was calculated in the 1920s in Germany. So if you look at your literature, different books and magazines and different disciplines have their little window. But if you stretch out and look at all the varieties of those things, you start to lay together a very comprehensive plan that we as a society are actually doing if we recognize it or not. And then you can test and question and see, are these things blocking, are they happening, and so on and so on.
As Matt talks about that, I'm thinking about going to the moon or this present crisis that we're in. Going to the moon was an opportunity for so many small businesses to wake up and say, I have a piece of this. So it's that vision that gets created, big, wild ass visions that get created, or viruses that stop us in our tracks, that ask new questions and ask what we have to offer. And so we've got in here 20,000 years of change in the next equivalent to 20,000 years of progress, in the next few years. Well, how do you deal with that? Well, you don't without a vision. You don't without a big, audacious goal that asks a lot of questions that you can then start, and you and your colleagues and anybody in the world that hears about it can say, I have a piece of that. I have a piece of that. And then they begin drawing out the information. So today it's so important that we ask these big questions, big questions of ourselves. And we can, I, as a person who has always been looking at what can we the people do, I believe we're ready to step up to these big, to find our part in it. And so we don't have to deal with the whole universe. We just have to find where we fit in these big challenges and find our difference.
Maybe you could give some pointers on that. I mean, if we look at the time that we're in right now, if we think about when the internet was first introduced, there were many businesses that went out of business because they couldn't adapt quickly enough. Now, it's clear to me that we're not going to go back to business as usual. So what kind of mindsets or what kind of even thinking exercises or leadership skills are required now to think way beyond business as usual and to avoid the trap of assuming that, oh, well, it's the internet, it's just another fad, it's not going to affect our business. Because there's a risk that many businesses are sitting in that space right now, not able to adjust to a totally new normal. So what kind of mental skills or thinking skills are required to get out of that trap?
Well, again, search the literature. When we, in the 70s, Gail was running her very creative business about education reform and change and the future of it, and I was doing the Renaissance Project. When we did the reading, we had 500 books that we had, the people we worked with, and they were on the shelves and stuff. And we could take those books today. Now, the language is a little different. Some of it looks a little old. We could take those books today, and if a person sat down and a group and discuss, you're not going to read 500 books, but with 30 or 40 people, read and discuss and talk, they will find out there's nothing that's happening now that's not in the literature. And so going back, studying, thinking, planning, modeling, having dialogue among all the people in your organization. Sometimes CEOs are wondering about things, and people down on the line already have the answer, and so, but they think it's a hierarchy rather than having their design sessions with representation from the entire organization and other companies, and sometimes competitors. We have done all of those things, and it's to open up the dialogue, open up the study, slow down, think, challenge yourself. These are the qualities that the arrogance of the last 20 years have sort of tended to wipe out.
I think for me, reading and doing or understanding intellectually something and actually starting to do it, there's a chasm there. Yeah. There's an abyss there for me in terms of what are my first steps that I have to take. And I think that this virus is helping us learn that. I mean, people are stepping up automatically to make masks. Oh, we can make masks. Oh, we can do this. We can do this, So we're learning, we're practicing ways to hear about a need and be able to respond to it without waiting for that bureaucracy, and we're realizing that the bureaucracy can't act as fast as we can. And so, it's going to take lots of practice to make that what we understand in our minds and we understand in our hearts, but we don't understand in the how to. It's going to take us a while to actually ramp that understanding up. But I think for this crisis and the ones that are going to follow, the ones that in our part of the world, fires, what's happening with communities to those fires that burn them to the ground. They're stepping up and learning all new kinds of ways to care for each other, to rebuild, they're learning skills themselves in terms of building their own homes where they've never done that before. So part of it is we've been a really reckless society, and we have assumed, for whatever benefits it has offered, that civil society is really pretty dumb. And we educate down, we don't expect enough of ourselves. So just opening up to our to the expectations of being dynamically critical to helping Earth restore herself and us in the process, I think is a big step forward.
And our history shows it.
Yeah.
In World War II, it took Ford months to go from never having built an airplane to running B-24s out the door one a minute by the thousands. Okay. And if you read the first 90 days when the United States went to war in World War II and read, it's all documented, of what people did and how fast they changed when they started doing things. It's, boy, if we could do that today. And the fact is we can. We could actually do it 10 times better today. So what is it? It's getting in the game and not complaining about the missiles that are coming at you and the unexpected that are coming at you. If we are too surprised about what the future brings us, we didn't do our homework.
Yep. I wanted to try and come up with some very practical ways of implementing this way of working. Now, Gail, you did mention earlier that we're still learning how to do this, but I want to use a specific analogy based on, Matt, you were using business as an example earlier. Gail, you used ravaged communities. So the analogy that I like is that everybody has a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, and that it's the way we come together and hold up the piece that we happen to bring. And then how do we collectively build the jigsaw puzzle, which is in essence the new normal. But practically, how does one do that? How does one allow for an opinion from somebody who you might not have allowed to speak before? And how do you cope with egos when big groups come together and you're trying to get to the bottom of something like this? Have you had any practical experience of this and any suggestions as to how, either in a community or in a business, you could coordinate a coming together and a questioning process like you've been talking about?
Well, we've had lots of practical experiences with our design shops. Our design shops originally were designed not for business. I mean, they weren't excluding business, but they were much broader. And when we worked with business, we brought all aspects together, as Matt said earlier, from the mailroom person to the chief executive officer. They were in the room together and they were designing together. And we brought in what we called wild cards, people with no particular interest in the business, but they were creative in their own right. And so emergence was just there. I mean, as people were designing together and understanding, I remember one person, we have something called Take a Panel, where everybody will reach out into the future and look back and see how they succeeded with an idea or played a role. And this executive who was very high up in the organization said, I can't believe it. I just can't believe what's in this room. He says, there is absolutely nothing that we can't solve if we would listen, if we're, while listening to each other. He said, I had no idea that the people, wherever they were in the organization, had more ideas than they knew what to do with. And they had more ways to step up and defend an idea or choose an idea. So that diversity is really important. And even families, dinner, can play with ideas out there and throw out wild cards and say, well, what if? And play. We have a model called playing suppose, which is take an audacious idea, put it out there.
Assume it's true.
Yeah, assume it's true.
And then what does it mean?
And so there are many ways that are in books but it's taking what's in the book and turning it into action. That is that relates to a person's own agency in terms of how they see themselves and their role in life. And that's what the waking up is that, oh, I do have a purpose. There is something I can do, rather than I can't get a job, I can't get an A, I can't do this, I don't know how to do this. Those are all irrelevant to the bigger questions you're asking, and to how do we work to make this planet a work of art and restore its beauty and balance.
Yeah, all the design shop does, besides the fact that it has a lot of information in the room where people are, but basically it just sets up a new game. It brings in, we had one where there was a strike in Christmas time, and they were blowing up offices and burning cars and things like that. 2 months later, they came together, designing together, and wrote the biggest, longest, and most open resolution to the problem that the federal government had ever experienced. And that lasted for years and years and years, because they no longer separated the union people from the management people in this huge, complex testing facility. And they worked together, and all the planning had representation from all levels of the organization and all scope of the organization as equals in that planning process. When the design was made, then of course, then it was implemented by more or less the existing way of doing it, because that's an efficient way of doing to run a complex organization. But it's not an efficient way to think. It's not an efficient way to plan. It's not an efficient way to come to consensus.
Perhaps a key takeaway here for business and community leaders is if you're planning on a new normal, to give voice to people who previously might not have had voice, and the widest diversity that you can include, the better your chances are of coming up with something that's going to be quite real. We've got a few minutes left, and I wanted to touch on a topic that you raised earlier, Matt, which was disciplines. And I wondered if you could touch on our past education systems and the idea of specialization versus generalization. Is there a role for specialization in this new normal we're experiencing? Or is generalization a better approach? Any thoughts on education in general and the way we tend to think in silos? Is that doing us any harm?
I'll say a couple of things and let Gail follow up on that. The dichotomy is that there's a difference between those two things. All of us are going to find our natural specialization. I can draw real well. I've been drawing real well for going on 70 years, right? And it came naturally to me, but of course I had to work at it. Someone else can't draw, but they can articulate in different ways. All of those different skill sets become individual, but the way we run the world today, it's like they conflict. And instead of saying all of us together have all the skills, and we have to learn to respect the complexity of all the jobs out there. We think there's these lower level jobs that any idiot can do. Try it.
Yeah, today we're learning differently.
Yeah.
So we're suddenly saying, hey, these teachers and nurses for heaven's sakes, and doctors have a role to play, a very important role. I mean, it's about time. And so what's going to happen to them as they they're not going to step back into society as it was. They're going to assume they see themselves differently. They will be different. You know, I know we're about out of time, but I want to respond to your previous question about, and maybe it's this, and that's the New Zealand experience I had. So I was part of a project to explore New Zealand's next 30 years of educational development with 1,600 people over 2 weekends. And it was a frightening thing for the Ministry of Education to set up. And they kept enforcing that we get more and more and more specific. And yet we held out. And so the conversations over 4 days, 2 days each, was on the philosophy and culture of education that was needed for the next 30 years and wanted. And these people came together with their hearts and minds like I've never seen before. It was just an incredible situation. And since then, indirectly, the New Zealand Prime Minister, who we have to say is wonderful in her own right, but she saw the difference that participation made, and they made the decision that they would never again invest in policies that didn't involve the citizens. And they are, if you read about what they're doing, the decisions they're making today, what they're doing to repress the virus and to stay safe, it's amazing. And so, you know, it doesn't take all of us together, but it takes these high magnitude events that enable people to see themselves in a fuller light, to see themselves that they have something to offer. We will offer it. As human, we love to participate. We love to make a difference. We love to see ourselves as part of the solution. And so, yes, as a piece, it's hard for me to do that. But when we organize ourselves around larger projects and bigger visions, it's easier to find ourselves.
And here's what we've learned. When any organization we've ever worked with comes in with a problem, the first thing we do is to put a much bigger viewpoint around that problem. Because if you try to do the problem on the level of the problem, well, all you have is what you have. But if you put a bigger context around it, then the problem becomes something which is part of a larger system, and you can start to see how it engages. And they get their answer. However, our job, that's only what we call the beans and rice part that pays the bills, and they get their solution and they move faster in their market or whatever they're doing. They can now build this airplane in half the time and half the cost or whatever. But it's the experience of people going through that and engaging with all these other people inside and outside their organization. Sometimes competitors coming together so that they can work together to cooperate here so they can compete there, right? And with rules of engagement instead of this, I'll kill you kind of approach. I'll put you out of business. That's how I'll do it.
Rules are pretty simple too.
Yeah, and the rules are simple. And when people have designed it and they're committed to it and they see the consequence, they're different people. And that's really what our job is about. Our job is to be practical with every assignment we have to a solution which is better and more comprehensive. At the same time, it is helping people. We're not changing them. We're creating an environment, a space, a place where they change themselves, where their true self comes out. And that's what we need, I think.
Fabulous. What a great place to wrap up on. Just to go back to the New Zealand example, a takeaway there I got is perhaps we need to shift away from representative democracy to more participative democracy, if there's such a word. And that excites me because in the blockchain space, there's a huge number of developments happening in that space. So because we don't have time here, if anybody listening to this is interested, go and do a search for decentralized decision-making, and you'll come up with a number of projects working in that space. So that's about wraps up our conversation. Any last thoughts, Gail or Matt, you'd like to add?
Many, but we're out of time.
It was fun.
It was fun. You were great.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful talking with you, and we will talk again soon. Go on.
Thanks, Michael.
Bye.
Be sure to check out the next interview in the Leaping the Abyss series, Don't You See How Many Lives We've Saved? With Greg Sarakoff. You can also find more information on each podcast by visiting bodyofknowledge.online.